Hello, welcome to the conversation here on News Central Television. This is a show where we bring you the latest updates and discussions on the biggest political stories happening around the continent. I'm Benga Aboroa.
And I am Rita Omodia. On today's edition of The Conversation, we'll be looking at the latest report by Transparency International, which is the Corruption Perception Index. Now, Transparency International, a global movement working towards ridding business, governments, civil society, and ordinary people of corruption, recently released its annual Corruption Perceptions Index, CPI report. Now, the CPI measures the levels of perceived corruption in the public sectors of 180 countries. 2 years into the devastating COVID-19 pandemic, this year's Corruption Perceptions Index, CPI, reveals that corruption levels have stagnated worldwide. Now, despite commitments on paper, 131 countries have made no significant progress against corruption over the last decade, and this year, 27 countries hit historic lows in their CPI score. Meanwhile, human rights and democracy across the world are under assault.
Now it says that South Africa is among the 131 countries that have, over the past 10 years, stagnated in ranking, scoring 44 on a scale of 0 to 100, alongside countries such as Tunisia, Ghana, Hungary, Kuwait, and Senegal. At the top of the scale in the 80s are Denmark, Finland, New Zealand, Norway, Singapore, Sweden, and Switzerland. And right at the bottom are Somalia and Syria with 11 and 13. Joining us today on the conversation to discuss Africa's rankings in the Corruption Perception Index. Latest rankings is Tafadwa Chikumbu, who is the Executive Director at Transparency International in Zimbabwe. We also have Samuel Kaninda, the Africa Regional Advisor for Transparency International. Gentlemen, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Now, Sub-Saharan Africa
Thank you very much.
scored...
Good evening.
Yes, thanks for joining us. Sub-Saharan Africa scored 33 out of 100, which the report says signifies an urgent need for countries to mitigate the devastation caused by corruption. Africa features as was on the list, and we've seen this happening for quite a number of years. We have systematic problems of corruption on the continent. Why is this? I would like to direct this question to Samuel.
Thank you once again for having us here. It points to deeper governance issues that we have on the continent. And I can give many examples. And this explains to a large extent why this part of the world, Sub-Saharan Africa that is where you find most of the deposits of the natural resources that the world needs to develop, to advance. At the same time, that's where you will find the poorest of the poor in the world around. So it points to a governance issue, a gap that needs to be closed in there to make sure that the resources that are in this part of the world will benefit most of the citizens, and that freedoms will be respected, and more importantly, that those who are in power will be held accountable by those that the people they are governing. So some of these gaps are apparent, and it reflects clearly on the ranking and rating in measurements like the CPI. So the issue lies at the core of these principles, but mainly also the practices and the impunity that you see of a few who would get away with plundering resources that are for the majority who are deprived of these resources. So short of addressing these issues at the core, the symptoms will keep on showing, like we see not only with this Corruption Perceptions Index, but many sister organizations who also measure governance at different levels on specific aspects. You would see that the results would corroborate what we have on the CPI.
All right, Samuel, you mentioned root causes of corruption as against the lack of principles in government. So I'll go over to you, Chikumbu. Now, as a member of Transparency International, Denmark, which is in the top 10 countries, just 4 years ago was involved in the biggest money laundering scam we've ever seen. when the country's biggest bank, that's the Danske Bank, was found guilty of laundering in excess of about 4 trillion rands. Now, Singapore is a tax haven and used for offshoring, while Switzerland built its fortune off a criminal economy by moving illicit assets around the world. And it continues to absorb the wealthy countries who are complicit in the system of corruptions around the world. So if you look at this, we have Denmark, Switzerland having so much talks on corruption. So would you say that these rankings are really fair?
Okay, thank you very much for asking that particular question. I just want to start by saying our Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index is an index that focuses on different forms of corruption, which includes bribery, diversion of public funds, prevalence of officials using public office for private gain without facing any consequences. It speaks about red tape and excessive bureaucratic burden. But our report does not cover issues to do with illicit financial flows and some of the enablers of corruption, which includes lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors, as well as money laundering. So it is quite important to know what is covered within the Corruption Perceptions Index. And we do admit that we do have countries across the world which are tax havens and secret jurisdictions which facilitate transfer of resources from most of the developing countries, especially in Africa. But it is unfortunate that our index does not venture into illicit financial flows, but it speaks specifically to components of corruption, which I have mentioned, also including the ability of countries to prosecute cases of corruption. But the report for 2021 also points out the role that tax havens and secret jurisdictions do play in facilitating the movement of funds from especially developing countries or the global north, the global south to the global north. So whereas we do not cover the incidences of illicit financial flows, we do recognize that there are countries that facilitate the movement of laundered and corruptly earned resources from the global south to the global north.
Now, I would like to come to you, Samuel. I remember reading John Kitongo's book titled It's Our Turn to Eat. John Kitongo was the head of Kenya's Anti-Corruption Commission. And a lot of people feel corruption is a victimless crime. I mean, it's government money. They say it's our turn and it's national cake, as some people term it. So what exactly is corruption? Is it just theft?
It is any abuse of power, entrusted power, for private gain and at the expense of the many. So there's the type of corruption that we experience on a day-to-day basis, which is when you need to access basic social services. I would call this, it's commonly known as petty corruption, which I would call corruption of survival, because you need to get access to primary health care, you need to get your kid at school, and you need to get your passport, within a relatively short period of time, and a bribe is imposed on you. So there's always that transaction that takes place. But there's also the type of corruption which is away from the public eye, which involves a few who are, sitting in high-level positions, but the consequences of those acts of corruption impact on the many. And this is when a contractor would collide with a public procurement authority to have his substandard tender approved. And at the end of the day, you have a breach for which public resources were expended that collapses either on kids going to school or just ordinary citizens commuting. So these are the types of corruption we have. And what John, who is also a former member of our movement, of TI John Kitongo, is saying, it's true, it speaks to the issue of impunity. And that's what the continent suffers a lot from, because sometimes it depends on how politically connected you are or how high level you are. then it means that you may actually escape justice. And once people know that there are no consequences for corruption, then it allows this situation that we are all decrying to perpetuate. So it's important that anti-graft institutions, anti-corruption institutions, those who come in terms of investigation, all the way to prosecuting and convicting those who are found to be, corrupt, will do their work without any political interference, and that they will have the means they need, the resources to be able to act, without fear of favor. And once any public official know that they would face consequences, either losing their job or even going to jail, I think people will think twice before getting into acts of corruption. And that's also what makes the difference with some of the countries that we have at the top of the index. It's not that they have no occurrence of corruption whatsoever, but the determining or the difference comes when what happens once corruption is reported, right? So it's important to have those frameworks in place.
Samuel, I'd like to follow up on points you raised earlier. You talked about having strong institutions, and in Africa, what we seem to have more of is big names, and some of these individuals have become institutions unto themselves. A country that comes quickly to mind, and it's been a poster boy for corruption on the continent, is Equatorial Guinea. The amount of corruption going on there is staggering. How do we make institutions work better for the general good of the people, so that regardless of the government that is in power, this anti-corruption institutions, the justice system would always work regardless of where the orders come from? Or are we far from getting to that point in Africa?
Yeah, I mean, in countries like Equatorial Guinea, it's good that you mentioned this example. It's quite tricky. It's a daunting task to achieve the situation that we would paint as the ideal. Why? Because anti-corruption is effective where a democratic system is also effective, where the rule of law applies. So where the rule of law applies, it doesn't matter how high you see it, or whether you are a big fish or a small fish that can easily be fried, you will face the music when an issue arises. And you don't have that in Equatorial Guinea because of the authoritarianism that you have in the country. There is no voice for people of decent opinions, who have dissenting opinions, I mean. So that's already a challenge. And in there, it could only be achieved maybe through the intervention of peers on the continent. We have the African Union, Equatorial Guinea being a member of the African Union. There are all these protocols. There's the Charter on the Values and Principles of Democracy, Governance on at the Africa level. There's the African Union Convention on Combating and Preventing Corruption. So all those tools could be invoked in the concert of nations to get some of these changes to happen. And you would see that in most of the countries where democracy or democratic governance is not in good shape, you also struggle to have the fight against corruption or corruption being addressed in a sustainable way, unless there is that political will and leadership from the top, which is not the case in Equatorial Guinea, because it's actually the elite that is benefiting, and we have so many cases that could be mentioned. There's the ill-gotten gains that were prosecuted, or the case that made its way in France. So you have many of these cases. On the other hand, where you have leaders who are resolute to make sure that corruption will not be the order of the day, the system of governance, there are specific steps that are taken, institutions are in place, and respect of the law and the constitution is also a reality, and the governance practice in those places are transparent, because when it is transparent, every citizen can know how resources are being expended and have explanations for decisions made by those whom they elect to govern them for a specific period of time. So these are some of the ingredients that needs to be there. And of course, the media can report and do its work just like civil society without fearing any reprisal. So those are some of the key mentions for you to have a corruption under
institution.
control in a given country.
Now, Kanide, I'm coming over to you, but before then, you mentioned something, Chikumbu, and which was on corruption being an abuse of power. And when I asked Kanide earlier, he said that money laundering is not necessarily a major component in the assessment of this corruption index that we have here. But wouldn't you say that money laundering is also an abuse of power? So why isn't it a major criteria or assessment for the corruption index?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I've mentioned the fact that corruption perception index covers a number of issues which I've mentioned. And just to mention that the corruption perception index at the point of collection of information, it uses different data sets, which are about 13 data sets from 12 credible sources. And those specific sources for now, they do not have components of money laundering, but as Transparency International, we do not only rely on the corruption perceptions index to determine the levels of corruption and the movement of funds from one country to the other, and also the abuse of public office for private gain. So apart from the corruption perceptions index, as a movement against corruption, we also have other internal in-country researches, global researches that focus on other thematic areas, including money laundering. And we do take cognizance of the East African Legislative ASAMLAG, which is responsible for combating money laundering. And we do work with different institutions within our own countries, including the Financial Intelligence Unit in the Reserve Central Banks in our own countries, to determine the levels of money laundering in each country, and how do we use the Financial Action Task Force recommendations to combat money laundering. So focusing on the specific index, of course, we do not have money laundering covered, but rather we do have other researches and the other work that we do focusing on money laundering. And we do also recognize that the United Nations Convention Against Corruption also speaks boldly about money laundering and the role that both state and non-state actors play in terms of combating money laundering in our own countries. So we do recognize that, but unfortunately, it is not part of the specific index.
Okay, Chikumbu, you're the executive director of Transparency International Zimbabwe, and we're looking at the aspect of Southern Africa now. Botswana has consistently ranked among the best performance in Africa when it comes to corruption perception index. What is Botswana doing that other countries aren't doing?
Yes, so initially when Samuel spoke, he talked about the ability of our own countries to create platforms where information about public affairs are discussed. Botswana has been consistent in terms of transparency and accountability, not just in public finance management, but even also in terms of the diamond extraction. Botswana is also ranked high in terms of other governance indices, where they create platforms for citizens, including their electoral processes, which have been confirmed to meet international standards. So when you look at corruption, it is not just an act of abuse of power for private gain, but it also extends to other aspects of governance, including having free and fair elections, where the leaders themselves, they observe and respect the separation of power. And Botswana is ranked high in terms of ensuring that there is separation of power. So in some countries like Zimbabwe, for instance, we do have the three arms of the state, but there are certain conditions that are created where the head of state, for instance, make use of statutory instruments to determine how public funds can be utilized in a given country. And that in itself affects how a country is ranked in terms of the corruption perceptions index. Botswana is also known for very robust legal and institutional frameworks, and also following the same legal and institutional frameworks. When it comes to other countries like Zimbabwe, we do have the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. We have the act that governs the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission. But we feel as citizens and also as Transparency International Zimbabwe that only having institutions in place without putting them into practice also contributes to our ranking low in terms of the Corruption Perceptions Index. So Botswana and other countries are actually performing well because of the governance systems that are in their countries and also their ability to enforce the same. I think this is something that we also recommend to our own governments in Zimbabwe, including the enactment of the whistleblower protection legislation. Botswana already have a whistleblower protection legislation which protects. Of course, they still have issues with regard to how that particular instrument is being implemented. So most of our countries in the region, they always lag behind in terms of implementing the global and regional anti-corruption institutions, including the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And as a result, our systems are not as robust and they are not being implemented.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chikumbu. I would like to come to Samuel here. And I understand that Mr. Chikumbu explained that illicit transfer of funds, money laundering is not under the purview of Transparency International in determining their rankings. But speaking for corruption in general, how big of a problem are safe havens and also safe tax havens and countries that host that keep this money in the Caribbean, these Jersey Islands, you have Switzerland, and all these places, how much would it be if it's brought to the forefront? Because when it comes to human rights, we have the G7 countries, they always implement a sanctions regime which acts to discourage abuses of human rights. And we do know how many billions of dollars Africa loses to illicit funds. Is it something that is an ongoing conversation? And what is done in the general fight against corruption to stop this Western countries from being recipients of stolen funds? I do have to say that we've seen a bit of steps happen in France, where Theodore Obiang, the vice president of Equatorial Guinea, has had some of his properties seized and is being tried in absentia. How can we expand the scope?
Yes, and that's a very important question. So it cannot be, and I'll take it from the last point you made in your question, which is that isolated case of Equatorial Guinea, which sets a very good precedent, but we need more coordination. We, being the African continent, needs more coordination into this. And it's good to see that beyond the report of a high panel of the African Union on illicit financial flows that goes back in 2014, so almost 8 years now, there's now an African common position on the recovery of assets. So that is important because without a legal framework, a basis, it becomes a problem for you to enact some of the decisions that you have taken as a state, as a government, and also there's need for mutual cooperation. Nigeria is actually one of the countries where the drainage in terms of illicit financial flows is quite significant. It amounts to billions of dollars. So, and we've seen that in the process to recover the loots, whether it is in the United States of America, in the UK, in Switzerland, or Liechtenstein, there have been hurdles occasioned by legal challenges or differences in the way that the legal frameworks of the two countries that are involved, be it Nigeria and Switzerland, speak to each other. So it was important to achieve that position, and discussions are ongoing. There's still much to do, but I believe it's in the right direction to get all the countries to rally, because what affects one country on the continent ends up affecting the rest. So it's important that beyond this common position, which addresses issues to do with the identification of those loots or the funds that are channeled or flown out of the continent, escaping the attention of national state institutions that would lose in terms of income, taxes, that those are identified. Then there's the whole process of recovery, repatriation, all the way to managing those assets. Because the issue that is also important is that when those assets, be it money or other forms of assets, are repatriated, it's important that they are managed in a transparent way so that we don't end up with a situation where these ill-gotten assets are repatriated to be stolen or misappropriated once again. So it is important because that position I'm talking about is quite holistic and comprehensive. But like we've been discussing since the beginning, it will be important to make sure that there's a mechanism to see to its implementation and also monitor progress and get some kind of feedback to see what works and what doesn't work until everyone, and especially the people of Africa, are satisfied that those resources are contributing to the betterment of their lives. So there is some ground that has been covered, but there's still a long way to go at the same time.
All right, thank you so much. There's still a long way to go in curbing corruption in the African region. Thank you so much, Samuel Kaninda and Tafazkoa Chikumbu. Thank you so much for your views. We'll take a quick break now, and when we come back, we'll move away from Southern Africa, the corruption index going on there, and we'll move to the western part of Africa and see how much corruption has affected the growth of West Africa. We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us on The Conversation. We're still beaming our searchlight on the 2021 Corruption Perception Index, which was released on the 25th of January 2022. Now, complacency in fighting corruption exacerbates human rights abuses and undermines democracy, failing authoritarianism, and then higher levels of corruption. We will look at this now as the CPI uses a scale from 0 to 100. 100 is very clean, and 0 is highly corrupt. In sub-Saharan Africa, 80% of countries have made little or no progress in the last 10 years. The gains of a handful of countries in the region are overshadowed by backsliding and stagnation in others.
Now, serious corruption problems are exacerbated by ongoing violent conflicts and terrorist attacks in countries from South Sudan to Mali. Unconstitutional changes of power, such as in Guinea, highlights political corruption, while severe impact this year of the COVID-19 pandemic has given governments an excuse to limit information and rights in Cameroon and Uganda. We still have with us Samuel Kaninda, the Africa Regional Advisor for Transparency International. Thanks for staying with us, Samuel.
Thank you.
Now, Mali has faced political crisis, including 3 military coups during the past 10 years. It's now ranked 29th on the Perception Index. How much of a contributory factor is this to military coups? Because once they come in, you hear the soldiers during their speeches always, oh, we came in to fight corruption and all of this. How much does corruption contribute to political instability?
Well, thanks for the question. I think corruption accounts for a large percentage, if I may put it in those terms. And you would listen to those who accede to power, the military coups that we have seen, but you need to go also a few weeks or even months before the occurrence of these coups to see that these are situations that are building up for some time. You know, you have the disgruntlement of citizens. In the case of the most recent one in Burkina Faso, a citizen have been decrying the failure of the state to protect them, especially in parts that are most affected by the terrorism, but also the corruption in the governance of the sector, the security sector, which means that even the meager resources that the state has to combat these crimes, the terrorism, is not finding its way to the soldiers who need it in terms of ammunition, their own salaries and what they need for equipment to be able to fight. And some have paid the highest price by being killed and all that. And next to that, you also have, the worsening economic situation of citizens. So when even an elected, democratically elected leadership government fails to listen and to attend to the grievances and the needs of its citizens, it can lead to these regrettable situations where, a democratically elected government gets deposed by the military. They take their cue from what they call the exasperation of citizens, but these are situations that could be prevented. So when it gets to this point, you see that there's the deep-seated corruption issues that now come and just deprives the state of its ability to cater for the citizens and to govern in a way that stabilizes the country and make the whole country move forward in terms of development, including socio-economic development, which is key for citizens.
Now, still looking at Mali, we know that there's an ongoing armed conflict in Mali. Do you also see this as a contributory factor?
Yes, in Mali, and I would consider that it's a complex situation. So the crisis go back to 2012 with the insurgency in the north of the country, with the Tuaregs, having their own grievances there. But at the core of the issue, it's an essentially governance deficit issue. So when, again, whether you are elected or not, but in this case, we are talking about democratically elected leaders who fail to attend to the basic governance needs, and some parts of the population in the country feel excluded, even in terms of access to their basic rights and also social needs. It leads to, again, the military taking up arms because of the lethargic state in which the apparatus of the state is found in. And we would say that in the case of Mali, we've seen the succession of this crisis also being essentially a governance issue. And corruption also finds its way because over these years of conflict, even including these coups, they've had 3 since 2012 and 2 in a matter of 2 years. It's mainly because of the disgruntlement, and the military again took upon these issues the exasperation of citizens who would be calling for leaders to go, the democratically elected leaders to go, and with no response to the key issues. And this leads to the situation that we are all observing now, which is becoming the currency in West Africa. And it's a worrying trend because it should now be a wake-up call for the economic community of West African states, not to wait for the situation to rot to the core, to come now to try and cure. So it's a situation where prevention would be better than cure. And by prevention here we mean that when there are signals that things are not going well, there's a protocol in the economic community of West African states on democracy and good governance. And that goes beyond, sending observers missions for elections and saying when, elected leaders are there, they should just deal with the issue of sovereignty in the countries. But when these coups, the military coups are taking place, they are taking the region backwards. So it would be important to prevent them. And one way is to strengthen governance, and particularly good governance, to make sure that we do not end up with, the region spiraling in this situation of coup d'etats. And it's quite sending the region in a backslide.
Okay. Yes.
I would like to use this opportunity to welcome our second guest on the panel. His name is Awal Musa Rafsanjani. He is the Executive Director of the Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center and Transparency International Nigeria. Thanks for joining us on the program, Mr. Rafsanjani.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Rafsanjani, just last year, after his inauguration, Zambia's new president, Hakainde Hichilema, said he inherited an empty treasury while horrifying amounts of money had been stolen. This is one thing we often hear on the continent. You hear the heads of anti-corruption bodies on the continent come out to say they recovered X million amounts of money. What mechanisms can be put in place to stop this theft from happening just before to nip it in the bud? Because we always, is it so easy to steal such huge amounts of money?
Thank you very much. I think it's all boiled down to the issues of strengthening our system, our governance system, and include also financial system. These monies are not taken through pocket. It is going through financial system in our various countries, which means that the role of our central banks, the role of the financial institutions is very paramount. And in the case of Nigeria in particular, where we are losing about $18 billion annually going into illicit financial flow, or money laundering, it means that our systems, our financial system is so loose, is so porous that people can be taking this money to deprive development, to undermine the effectiveness of governance in the country. And therefore, there must be certain, fundamental, reforms that need to be put in place to ensure that, those gaps and those, lapses in our financial system are closed, so that no way people will have opportunity to siphon this public taxpayers' money. That's number one. Number two, there should be sanction. If people are conniving to siphon public taxpayers' money, there must be consequences.
Mm.
Yeah.
Now, the inability of the government to ensure that people are brought to book for violating financial regulation is what is encouraging more impunity in the system. Unfortunately, those who are supposed to stop it from happening, they are most times they are the one that creates the opportunity for those who are willing to do that. So in other words, there's a conniver with those people. Thirdly, we have a legislature and parliament across Africa. They need to begin to strengthen their oversight on government, departments, parastatal government programs and systems. That is why they are elected as lawmakers. But if you compromise as a lawmaker, you are not able to provide the necessary oversight, ensure accountability, then definitely you are not adding value to democracy, and you are not helping the country to overcome these abuses that goes on, unabated. I think again, also, the inability for African countries to work closely with their counterpart international community is also helping, because if you are in having a good relationship and even in most cases sign memorandum of understanding in terms of for example, in the case of US, we have biocommission. We have also in other countries, we have mutual legal assistance, where if money that is meant for Nigeria, some wicked public official have stolen the money, there should be a kind of legal framework that is agreed by both countries to get these resources back to the country that the money is taken.
Okay.
So in the case of Nigeria, for example, we have legal mutual assistance with some number of countries. But again, like I said, the drivers of helping to stop this or ensuring that this thing is blocked, they themselves, they are not ready to ensure that they play the role they're supposed to play.
All right,
So
Rafsanjani, sorry to butt in there. You're talking about Nigeria, and according to the records, because you're also a member of Transparency International, Nigeria hit a historic low of 24. Now, we would know, because you mentioned Nigeria in most of your examples, that President Muhammadu Buhari in his second term and in his first term came on the mantra of fighting corruption. But we see nowadays political parties rather fighting opposition, and we hear talks of once you come to the winning political party, somehow your sins are over. So how would you rate the administration of President Muhammadu Buhari in his fight against corruption, which was his main mantra?
So let us be very clear. to campaign that you want to fight corruption and, to continue to lament about corruption is different from, really fighting corruption, which include putting systems, bringing in legal framework or policy framework to block leakages. Fighting against corruption, it is not about the drama that we have arrested somebody, that we have recovered X, Y, and Z. No, it is not enough. Fighting corruption, it has to do looking at your own systems, legal processes, and also the practice that happens in the country to first ensure that you block the leakages. You block even the corruption from happening before even you go and start, chasing, probably you're chasing $10,000, maybe what you will spend in recovering that $10,000, you will spend like $100,000. It is not cost effective. So the cost effective is to block the leakages by bringing in those legal frameworks that will ensure that corruption did not happen. And if it happens, you have a legal system, you have a judicial system that will ensure those who violated that have received consequences. Now, in the case of the Nigerian president, he promised to fight corruption, but unfortunately, fighting corruption, it is not about just issue of bribery, collecting bribe. No, fighting corruption and corruption itself, it goes beyond the issue of giving bribe or taking bribe. It also includes political corruption. And in the case of Nigeria, political corruption is one of the main sources of corruption, deepening corruption in Nigeria. For example, the electoral system is such that it favors corrupt people who have stolen money. Now during the election, they will come and bring in this money with a view to capture power and continue siphoning public taxpayers' money. What have you done as a president who had promised to fight corruption, to block the leakages in terms of the electoral process, so that there's electoral integrity, so that the electoral process is such that Nigerians have confidence to be able to participate in it? As it is now, it is for sale. It is for the highest bidder, because the way they commercialize even the nomination, you can see that if you have not stolen money or you do not have good fathers, there's no way
you can afford a nomination form
in Nigeria.
Now, if you're looking at this, Rafsanjani, the Whistleblower Protection Agency, because earlier on, I guess Hamida talked about whistleblower protection agencies in Nigeria. Do you see it as being effective enough?
There's no legal protection on whistleblowing. What you heard was that the government was desperate, the government was broke, and they were looking for money. So what they did was to say that, okay, we're going to have a whistleblowing policy that if you help us, expose corruption or tell us where somebody has stolen money, we'll give you XYZ percentage. Now, it's different from having real legal, whistleblowing regime in place, where it clearly spells out, both the incentives, the sanction, and the protection of the whistleblower. As it is now, the policy is already dead. Nobody is even, talking about it, because it was even domiciled in the Ministry of Finance. And the purpose of that was just for government to be able to identify some properties, some money that some of the previous, official regime have, hidden. Now, even when Nigerians have volunteered those credible information, they then get those incentives they promised to give them. And secondly, to make it, lasting, what we have been advocating is that let us have a legal framework on the whistleblowing that clearly spells out how a whistleblower should be, how what benefit he has, what protection he or she has. These are things, and what consequences of providing fake and unsubstantiated information should be.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rafsanjani. We're fast running out of time. And Mr. Samuel Kaninda, in 60 seconds, please, what strategies can be adopted to bring corruption to the barest minimum on the continent?
We'll keep repeating. I mean, that the commitments are there. We are not asking for new commitments. All we're asking is that the existing commitments, be they on illicit financial flows, what you have on the African Convention, the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption, that of the United Nations, the OGP commitments, those are open government. If all those commitments are to be implemented and there are ways to monitor progress, periodically, I think we'll have covered some ground, because it covers
Right.
everything that one needs to have a transparent and accountable system, and also to fight impunity.
Thank you so much, Samuel Kaninda. You've spoken really about how we can curb corruption rate in the African continent. Thank you so much for joining us on the conversation. Also, thank you, Awal Musa Rafsanjani, for sharing so much light on the corruption index in West Africa, especially in Nigeria.
I would also like to thank Mr. Tafadzwa Chikumbu for joining us from Harare, Zimbabwe. It's been a pleasure having you all. Thanks for your insight.
Thank you.
And that's all on the conversation for today. We look forward to joining us again on Wednesday. Bye-bye.
I'm Rita Amwadia. Do have a pleasant day.
Aboroa.